The St. Cuthbert Gospel is a pocket gospel book from the 8th century. When it was sold to the British Library in 2012, it went for £9 million. And sure, it might be the earliest known surviving example of bookbinding, but I can't imagine it's much of a page-turner, not least because you'd probably have to learn how to read Latin first. Conversely, a copy of The Hobbit, a hugely influential book, easy to read and beloved by many, will cost you, well, quite a bit less than that.
Why are we telling you this? Well, the price of a work is really a mark of how much fun you're going to have with something. And when you're looking at a book that is expensive or difficult to obtain, you have to ask yourself, is it worth the hassle? Although ultimately, this is just a long-winded way of saying, greetings, pestigores, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Today we are lost, and we are damned. Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned is the second half of the Realm of Chaos series and was released in 1990, 2 years after Slaves to Darkness. It's longer than its sibling at 296 pages and has recently been reprinted and sold at Warhammer World. This, however, is an original copy, sent to us along with Slaves to Darkness by the very generous Storm Knight. Big thanks again, my dude. Original copies of this book can sell for outrageous prices due to the book's age and rarity, although those recent reprints are sold for £35, allowing more people to have their own copy and only slightly undermining the intro to this video that was written before the reprints were announced. But if you have an original, then you can be smug in the fact that the original's cover art has a slightly sharper print quality. Like, slightly, barely noticeable. Just let us have this.
Just like last time, know that there's a lot in this book we won't be able to cover if we're to keep this video to a sensible length, since book long. There'll be a lot of referring back to our video on Slaves to Darkness too, so if you haven't seen that, it's probably worth a watch before this one. Also, apologies for the sometimes dubious quality of the scans that we'll be using in this video. It was the best we could find. We didn't want to subject our copy to the scanner too much since it's old, and despite being over 1,000 years younger, the binding of the Realm of Chaos books has often deteriorated about as much as the St. Cuthbert Gospels has.
So, Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned is much like its sibling publication, allowing you to use the forces of chaos in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Warhammer 40,000. This one containing information on the other two Chaos gods not in the previous book, Nurgle and Tzeentch, as well as a host of other related guff. The lovely cover art is by Les Edwards this time around, who you may know from his iconic Hero Quest cover art. The Lost and the Damned was good enough that it was also used by Finnish metal band Dethrone for their album Let the Day Begin in 1989. Not entirely sure they got permission for that, but whatevs. One of the big differences between this book and Slaves to Darkness is that it's laid out, I don't know, friendlier? Slaves had its information scattered throughout the book, making it easy to get a little overwhelmed, whereas Damned is a little more straightforward and even has handy summaries at the end, not just of itself, but of the previous book also. Hell, it even has a summary of Warhammer Fantasy's rules at the start.
Another change is one of aesthetics. The art this time around has a bit of a different vibe to it, even if several artists did art for both books. There's less stark black and white, and when it is there, the print, at least in our copy, is slightly less dark, giving the whole thing a more muted tone. And while we think Slaves' art stands out more due to this, it's not to say that Damned is lacking in interesting art, because it's full of it. The first thing in the book is the short story The Siege of Prague by Rick Priestley, which is, and brace yourself here, about the siege of a town called Prague by the forces of chaos and how such things do not go so great. It's a neat little story, setting the tone of grim inevitability when dealing with the forces of chaos. And, by the way, we are a huge fan of giving individual credits to the story writers. It's not on every bit of fiction, sadly, but it is cool nonetheless. It also introduces the new weapon, arrows, which I'm sure isn't just an error they didn't catch, and is in fact a new special type of arrow, like maybe a double-shafted arrow. Please add that to the lexicanum. It's real. It's canon.
But you probably want to hear about the gods. Well, first up is Nurgle, the god of death and decay. It does a really good job of establishing why people might end up worshipping them. Happiness and human endeavour are sired by a coming to terms with decay and futility. This realisation is key to understanding the great lord of decay and his worshippers, which neatly explains why a faction based so heavily around death and disease should be so jolly. Also, this Nurgling in a top hat right here? He's definitely in my top 3 Nurglings now. The Nurgle demons in this book are great unclean ones, who are stated to be more or less facsimiles of Nurgle themselves, both physically and in terms of personality, so it can be said that every one of them is also Nurgle, as well as their own distinct entity. Plague Bearers, the demons who are created from those that die of Nurgle's rot, Nurglings, who are as adorable as they are gross, and Beasts, whose art is somehow more goofy than the current model is, and that is meant entirely as a good thing.
Despite its fearsome appearance and deadly attributes, the Beast is a friendly and affectionate creature, behaving in all respects like an over-friendly and easily excited puppy. In battle, the Beasts run backwards and forwards in their eagerness to meet new friends, constantly rolling over and inviting the Plague Bearers to scratch their backs and pop their pustules.
Ah, but also, ew. Now for the Architect of Fate, Tzeentch, the God of Change. They're the enemy of Nurgle since, quote, his energy comes from the excitement and will to change, to forge one's destiny, change fortune, and gain power. This is quite the opposite of Nurgle, whose power comes from the defiance of despair and hopelessness. End quote. The demons available to Tzeentch are the Big Burb Boys, the Lords of Change, who are basically this guy. Pink and blue horrors who had quite a different look back then, flamers who spew magic flames that create mocking impersonations of you while burning you to death, and the discs, which are the strange mounts of Tzeentch. Sometimes they appear similar to a modern disc, although often they're pretty much just screamers, which makes sense since that's what discs are made from anyway. But you can't call them screamers either, since in this book, screamer was just another name for a horror. So, you know when we say that Warhammer is unnecessarily confusing sometimes? Yeah. That.
Like Slaves to Darkness, you can use this book to create Chaos Champions, with new gifts that the two gods featured can bestow. Champions of Tzeentch could get, amongst other things, a flaming arm, wings, or ecstatic duplication, which is where they turn a little bit into a pink horror, right down to splitting into two blue horrors when killed. Champions of Nurgle could get a variety of things that may or may not clear up with a robust treatment of antibiotics, such as a Nurgling infestation, a trail of slime, or even Nurgle's rot itself. Which was more than an abstract lore thing, this book actually had mechanics for it. If a mortal model has close contact with a sufficiently Nurgly thing, then they must roll a d6 to see if they catch the rot. If they roll a 6 after the relevant modifiers are applied, they catch it. And at the start of the battle, if one of your models has the rot, then you roll another d6, and on a 6 it's passed on to another randomly chosen model in your warband. Once a model has Nurgle's rot, it is incurable, and the choices are A. Retire your character, B. Go on a death quest to please the god of their choice enough that they'll elevate the character to demonhood and thus be saved from the rot, or C. Just have the character slowly mutate and decay until they eventually die and are turned into a plague bearer. You know, I'm going to be honest, reading about the game mechanics for a deadly, highly infectious disease was way more fun 6 months ago.
Moving on from the horrors of the real world, both factions had their own items and spells too, like Death Heads of Nurgle, the head of an enemy filled with the pus of a great unclean one, that you lob at people to give them Nurgle's rot, or the spell Transformation of Tzeentch, in which a person goes through mutations so quickly that all that remains is a ruin of flesh, feather, slime, and indescribable organic refuse, making a model unavoidably dead. Now, of course there is a lot more than just demons in the book. There's a large section on beastmen, the half-man, half-beast faction that were probably inspired by the Brew, a similar race from RuneQuest that Citadel had previously made minis for, and oh boy, you do not want to look those up because yikes, my dudes. Beastmen were created by chaos energy leaking into the world, mutating man and beast into amalgams of the two. As such, they tend to side with Chaos forces when they're not fighting them, or each other, or anyone else who happens to be in the vicinity. They're quite big on the fighting.
Beastmen with horns are called Gors, and all those without are called Bray. If their horns aren't bovine or goat-like in appearance, or if they aren't even on their head at all, then they are called Ungors, which we are told means not quite right Gors. Which, although still around today, the models don't necessarily follow those strict horn definitions anymore. There's also rules for beastmen specific to the 4 chaos powers: Korngors, Pestigors, Slangors, and Zangors. Of those, the only ones that currently still have models are Zangors and Pestigors, although the latter are just in Blood Bowl. As well as rules for making Beastman warbands, there's also rules for Centaur warbands, Minotaur warbands, and Dragon Ogre warbands, all of which, along with Beastmen, are part of the Beasts of Chaos army these days, you know, as long as you squint at Centaurs and pretend they're regular centaurs. Also in here are rules for other chaotic units like Chaos Thugs, Plague Zombies, Plague Skeletons, or Spawns of Tzeentch, although these don't get quite as much attention as those beastly chaps.
Moving on, there's a large section for narrative campaigns, where a game group could, for example, all roll up a champion and their retinue and fight it out using the narrative generator, with models from their warbands gaining rewards, injuries, or even permanently dying. The narrative generator is split into multiple segments, allowing for you to generate many different scenarios. Like this one, where two champions both learn of a convoy of precious jewels heading towards the Empire and both attempt to rob it, fighting each other and the guards protecting it. Or this one, where two warbands are wandering in a wooded area in the Chaos Wastes when suddenly the land detaches itself from the ground and floats upwards, leaving the warbands to try and claim the Sky Island for its resources. Although the most fun one is the narrative subplots table, where the GM would roll up surprises that the players would not be aware of. So say they rolled an 86, then at some point in the battle bounty hunters would show up and try to attack one of the warbands. Or if they rolled a 65, then there would be a mysterious sword hidden on a battlefield with random powers available to whichever player finds it.
You also have a casualty recovery chart, which you roll on after a game to see what becomes of the models that were incapacitated during it. Many will just be unconscious and return in the next battle unscathed, but it is possible to pick up facial scars, lose eyes, or even limbs, many of these affecting their stats, and it's encouraged that you even model these on your miniatures. Although that does make me imagine someone angrily muttering that it took them ages to get the face painted right as they file off a nose. There's also a 10% chance of the model just straight up dying, which to be fair seems like pretty good odds considering it's Warhammer after all. Expanding on ideas from Slaves to Darkness, there's also a large section detailing how to make lesser chaos powers, including an array of demons for them. We'll refer to these powers as lesser gods here for simplicity, although we're aware that's not a super accurate definition, don't worry. There's a lot to the process, and it even straight up tells you that you'll have to start inventing your own rules to make it fully function. But there is a handy chart that you can roll on for attributes your lesser god might have if you can't decide for yourself. So your OC god could always be seen with a staff, or on a boat, or eating themselves. Perhaps our favourite, just for being weird, is remove limbs. As the demon speaks, it idly removes parts of its body, its arms, legs, head, wings, and so on. These flap around on their own and eventually make their way back to the main body, which is normal.
They used the example of Queethel Gristlegut to show how one could create an entire pantheon. Queethel was originally a Skaven hero who became powerful enough to ascend to demonhood, and Queethel's rewards are suitably themed. His followers could gain his Skaven attributes like a tail or the propensity to repeat words, or gain things like a hunchback or a bestial face. Chaos rewards he himself acquired as a mortal. Like the rest of the process, creating your own demons that serve your god are a lot, and it shows ones rolled up for Queethel that are kind of freaky. Just for a lark, we thought we'd roll up a lesser demon ourselves, and this is what we got. Suggestions in the comments as to what this demon should be called, because I'm currently alternating between Baby and Abomination.
Another fun little segment in here is a guide on how to write in the language of chaos, the Dark Tongue. It's much like the glyphs you see in all the Orc codices, and it's pretty cool but mostly useless in your day-to-day life unless you happen to make YouTube videos and want to flash things like this up on screen just to see if anyone will try and work out what it says. I suppose we should show you some of the lovely models in the colour section of this book, but have you really been good enough, dear viewer, to deserve such a treat? What do you think, Snipe?
I'm not sure. I don't think I've heard enough liking and subscribing. What do you think, giant Necromunda standee that we own for some reason? Oh, stop teasing and show 'em.
You know when you're not sure if something you wrote is actually funny or if it's just weird? First up we have the Independent Demons, which given the results we got from the generator has some wild conversions. Our favourite is the Ladybird Demon. I mean, I'm not sure how many people outside of Greenfly are scared of ladybirds, but that's neither here nor there. On the subject of bizarre conversions, there's also Pete Taylor's collection, full of converted models, the spawn being particularly, well, spawny. And like, I don't know if this was like just a thing you could buy or how much of it was converted, but this thing here should absolutely not have been allowed. As ever, it's fascinating to see these older models, especially as people who aren't as familiar with the old fantasy line as we are with their grimdark equivalents. Particularly love this old Dragon Ogre. It's just cool. As you would expect, there's also Chaos Space Marines in here, although I just want to draw your attention to this Chaos Squat model. Not for any other reason than I just really like it.
I'm sure you're all wondering about the 40k rules and lore side of things. Well, this has a bunch. We get a load of information regarding the type of things that go on those demon planets within the Eye of Terror we hear so much about. Like how on the world of Bubonicus there is a ring of humans around its equator, which sings and dances praising Nurgle. When one of them succumbs to Nurgle's rot and becomes a plague bearer, they go to join their demon master and new mortals take their place. Cults of all kinds get brought up, not just those of the Chaos persuasion. From the Imperial cult to the Cult Mechanicus to Space Marine cults. 40k is just really heavy on the whole cult thing, really. Again, here it makes a more reasoned case for how people end up worshipping Chaos than you'll often see. Some see it as an avenue to power, some belong to a tribe who worship the god under another name unknowingly. For some, it's a sense of adventure in an otherwise dreary life, and some just think they're in some kind of social club, which, I mean, we've all been there. All this gives a little more agency to the cultist than you usually see, which is just kinda rad.
Then we have the Emperor of Mankind, and it gives a startling amount of detail on his backstory. Born to mortal parents circa 8000 BC in central Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, he was thought to just be a regular child, just like his brothers and sisters, which we just learned he had. So that's neat. However, he was in fact the result of a plan by the world's remaining shamans. You see, they were losing their ability to reincarnate due to humanity affecting the nature of the warp and starting the rise of capital C Chaos. Those thousands of shaman all swallowed poison and concentrated their energy into reincarnating into a single body, the Emperor. Although in the backstory he's simply referred to as the New Man before he adopts his self-aggrandizing title. Over the millennia, he would use his powers in large and small ways, adopting personas and using his wisdom to teach people, crop management. So yeah, mankind thrived, the warp got worse, Khorne was born from an era of war, Nurgle from an era of plagues, and Tzeentch from, well, just politics in general. Slaanesh would be born much later after the Eldar did, well, basically everything you can find on the darkest corners of DeviantArt, but with extra gusto.
This all leads to the Horus Heresy, which, interestingly, in the 2 years since the previous book, had already changed into more or less its current form. General Horus went from possibly just being a regular Marine to being Warmaster Horus, Primarch created in the Emperor's gene labs. Sanguinius, as well as several other Primarchs, are here too. That one time the Emperor was choked out by an orc and saved by Horus is here, and the final battle takes place on Horus's flagship rather than his bunker. We even get a recounting of the battle written by William King, accompanied by this iconic artwork by Adrian Smith.
The Emperor stands transfixed, trying to force frozen words from his tongue. In the end, he can only whisper, "Why?" Mad laughter rings out. Why? You ask me why? Have all the millennia taught you nothing, weak fool? Your timidity prevented you from binding the forces of chaos. You shied away from the ultimate power. I have bound it to my will and will lead humanity into the new age. I, Horus, Master of Chaos.
It's genuinely a good read, and it's fascinating to see a story from the perspective of the Emperor in this era of the game. Also kind of fun that it just dumps the finale of the Heresy in here, while the modern Heresy books still haven't got there in, over 50 books at this point? Although hinted at in the previous book, this is also where we get the whole Star Child thing from. The idea that the soul of the Emperor is adrift in the warp, and one day this Star Child will be born again, just as the souls of the shaman that created the Emperor were in him. The concept is also referenced in Ian Watson's Inquisition trilogy, the first book in the series, coming out the same year as this, but for reasons we're sure that many of you are aware of, we really don't want to dig too deep into that can of worms.
The Sensei from Slaves to Darkness return as well, albeit slightly altered. Rather than just specifically the sons of the Emperor, they are now simply his descendants. And it seems the Grey Sensei, that is, Sensei who have fallen to Chaos, are possibly no longer a thing anymore, since they're stated to be invulnerable to the predations of the Chaos powers. There's full rules to make a Sensei Adventurer band too, which are a Sensei joined by a ragtag rebel group that may actually include other Sensei. Since they are described as being to the Star Child what Chaos Champions are to the Chaos Gods, they can gain rewards from the Star Child just like champions do from their chosen god. For example, getting a heroic name like the Hawk, the Masked Avenger, or the Liberator. Becoming a Master of Disguise, or just getting really good at sword. And just like how a Chaos Champion's endpoint is becoming a Demon Prince or a Spawn, the goal for Sensei is APOTHEOSIS, where they pass from the mortal world and join with the Star Child. However, they can return to the mortal realm, and sometimes will do so just to aid their former comrades on future adventures, which is jolly decent of them.
Given the focus is Nurgle and Tzeentch in this book, there are also specific lists for them both in 40k. featuring the Death Guard and the Thousand Sons, along with some early fluff for them. The Death Guard follow a roughly similar story to their modern version, wherein they side with Horus during the Heresy and their corruption into proper plague marines with their bodies oozing slime happens on a trip to Earth. However, the circumstances as to how it comes about are quite different. But we won't go too deep into that, because Wib already accidentally spoiled himself on a book that only came out last year while researching this bit, so we're not going to do that to you. You're welcome. The Thousand Sons are again broadly similar to their current iteration. Being initially loyal to the Emperor, but after the Space Wolves burned Prospero, they had no real choice but to side with Horus. However, there's no talk about the flesh change, and it wasn't Horus who spurred the Wolves to try and destroy the Thousand Sons. That was just what the Emperor ordered in this version, which is a rare example of a retcon that makes one of the Emperor's actions less bad. But as ever, it's cool to see how much of those early stories have remained intact after 3 decades.
For Nurgle forces, there are specific gifts of Mortarion, although it should be noted there's no gifts of Magnus for Tzeentch forces for some reason. So a Nurgle champion can refuse their regular Chaos reward and instead roll on this table. It contains yet more Nurgly stuff like Sleeping Sickness, where your champion can literally just fall asleep if no enemy is within 12 inches of them. Spouts Blood, where your champion emits blood from their facial orifices but are otherwise unaffected. Or Gigantic Boil, where, and I quote, "A gigantic boil grows right in the middle of the champion's forehead. It swells until it is the size and colour of a ripe melon. The boil may burst during any hand-to-hand combat round." Oh, and there is also Gastric Gripe, which is, well, it's your character just farts and everyone cheers, okay? Your fart gas means that your opponent has a -1 to hit you. It's a thing. As for the Nurgle army list itself, well as regular Traitor Marines and Plague Marines, there are Terminators, which, after toying around with a few looks, had by this point settled on what we think of as the regular Terminator aesthetic. There's also Pestigors, Diseased Flagellants, Cultists, Spawns, Hounds, Nurglings, and Chaos Squats. The little bit of lore we get for those states that some of the squat homeworlds sided with Horus during the Heresy, and so fled into the Eye of Terror along with the rest of his forces afterwards. You know, just in case you're wondering where Chaos Squats came from.
On the Tzeentch side of things, they get much the same list as Nurgle, but with Thousand Sons instead of Plague Marines. They also had Thrall Wizards instead of Flagellants, Zangors instead of Pestigors, and they can't take Nurglings for reasons we hope are obvious to you. Both factions can also have Creatures of Chaos, which are mentioned earlier in the book as a fantasy thing. It basically means that if you roll a D1000 well enough, you could end up with a Jabberwock in your army. Or if you're really unlucky, you could just get a bunch of rats. Although the most surprising addition to both the Chaos forces are orcs. Freebooters to be exact, which does make sense. They will fight alongside anyone who pays them. You just don't necessarily expect to see orky boys palling around with the Death Guard, you know? Although, saying that, and hear me out, Orc Stompers are supposed to resemble the orc gods Gork and Mork, and Stompers are kind of shaped more like Nurgle than any orc, so...
Could the orc gods Gork and Mork be in actuality the chaos god Nurgle? No, that's just silly.
Actually, before we wrap up, something we said we'd talk about in this video was the connections that the Realm of Chaos books drew between the worlds of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000. More specifically, we'd seen a lot of people over the years state that these books specify the two games exist in the same universe. And, well, we wouldn't quite go that far. There are small connections, a couple of examples being how in the demonic battlefield reward chart, the result out of time meant that a warband could be sent from Warhammer Fantasy to 40k or vice versa as a joke by their patron, or how Sensei Adventurer bands are usable in Fantasy as well as 40k. But they strike us as being less hard lore and more just fun ways of playing with the fact the two systems were so compatible at the time. But, you know, that's just our interpretation of this, and we're coming at it from an angle of the present day where the worlds are not connected, so naturally we'll feel like any implication of a connection needs to be a lot more explicit before we'll read it as canon. After all, the scale of threat that Chaos poses in the two settings is so vastly different, it's hard to think of them as being the same thing. But if you were reading this back in 1990, where there wasn't another 30 years of established lore, then yeah, we can see how these, along with the other little connections, like the fantasy chainswords and slaves, could lead you to interpreting the two settings as being connected. Either that, or we just missed the bit where it explicitly said so. It's possible, because, as we said earlier, book very long.
So, to get all the way back to the idea that this video started with, is Realm of Chaos: The Lost and the Damned worth picking up in 2020? An original copy? Well, for most people, considering the price, probably not, unless you fancy yourself a collector of such things and you have the income to do so. The book is great, but, you know, there are limits. However, if you can get your hands on one of the reprints, and you have an interest in the history of Games Workshop's games, you'll have a lot of fun reading the early Chaos lore and seeing how differently GW's games worked back then. Hell, it's interesting just to see how much things have changed between this and Slaves to Darkness. Plus, like its companion book, there are plenty of mechanics in here that are fun to play with, even if you never intend to play a game with it. It's just a pity it's exclusive to Warhammer World, and so most people are at the mercy of eBay prices, or finding someone who lives near Nottingham who's willing to get a copy for them.
But this video is now done, and I won't lie, it's quite nice to finally have the other half of this complete, because wow, are the Realm of Chaos books kind of intimidating to cover because they're so long and dense.
Thank you very much for watching this 20th episode of Codex Compliant, and just watching the series in general. As you might have been able to tell from the length of this video, it was quite a lot of work, so now we're going to go and lie down in a dark room for a while.
Upon reflection, it was just weird, wasn't it?